This time, the chair recognizes Ms. Craig for 5 minutes.
Thank you. Chairman Butterfield, Ranking Member Style, and members of the committee, thank you for the opportunity to testify today. My name is Jiore Craig, and I'm the head of digital integrity at the Institute for Strategic Dialogue, where I oversee our work around elections. I've spent 9 years as a public opinion researcher examining how foreign and domestic actors use social media during elections to deceive their publics. My experience includes hundreds of elections in the United States and more than a dozen other countries abroad. I hope you will take one big point away from my testimony today. Disinformation targeting voters remains a significant threat, not only to our own citizens, but to citizens and democracies worldwide. We will only counter it effectively if we look at the systems, policies, product features, and business models that drive the actions of social media companies and those sourcing disinformation, instead of merely chasing after the false or pernicious content that specific disinformation campaigns promote. While it is impossible to know the precise breakdown of foreign versus domestic disinformation efforts, due in large part to a lack of transparency on the part of the social media platforms, ISD research suggests domestic disinformation targets Americans at a higher volume and frequency than foreign campaigns. Electoral disinformation has become a global enterprise, and each election serves as a petri dish for experimenting and learning from fellow disinformation entrepreneurs' global experiences. My written testimony summarizes the nature of recent domestic disinformation tactics, as well as recent foreign state-sponsored and foreign commercial disinformation attempts. Anyone can decide to pursue disinformation tactics for profit, and anyone can hire commercial actors to use disinformation tactics to influence an election. The online presence of such actors can be as anonymous and profitable as laws and platform policies allow. Consider the following report of domestic disinformation. Research in 2020 found a website purporting to represent an organization called Protect My Vote. This so-called organization was allowed to run a digital ad campaign with more than 150 ads aiming to erode trust in mail-in voting. Some of the paid posts featured an image of LeBron James and falsely claimed he had expressed concerns about the use of mail-in voting. Facebook eventually removed the page for engaging in voter suppression tactics. This example features tactics and systems common to many successful disinformation campaigns, including misleading organization names, the unauthorized use of trusted messengers, hidden sources of advertising funds, as well as Facebook's election policies and advertising model in action. In our country and in other democracies, there is understandably an intense focus on the content of electorally focused disinformation efforts. But this focus on content can obscure the role of systems at play in enabling disinformation. Recent reporting demonstrates that the way social media companies make business decisions about what to show Americans around elections has a significant impact on how successful disinformation campaigns are in reaching Americans. This is why it is so important to focus on the systemic aspects of disinformation on social media. There are two key reasons that a focus on disinformation content often eclipses disinformation systemic forces. First, most of us primarily experience disinformation as content. Voters, journalists, researchers have extremely easy access to disinformation on a day-to-day basis. It is much harder to obtain information about the hidden systems that enable such disinformation, like who is paying for the content, who is making money from a person engaging with the content, or whether the accounts sharing content are neighbors, foreign citizens, or fake accounts. This opacity is no accident. Social media companies and bad actors are intentionally not transparent with much of this information, likely to obscure the systems at play, enabling them to profit or benefit from disinformation. The second reason the conversation tends to focus on content rather than systemic dynamics is because many stakeholders in the disinformation marketplace want to center free speech protections naturally evoked in a debate focused on content. Unfortunately, this approach does not protect free speech, which should be defended at all costs, but instead help stakeholders avoid responsibility for the systems they rely on, which, if examined, would likely lead to further protections for speech. If we continue to stay focused on content alone and not on systems, those spreading disinformation will continue using social media to take full advantage of the product features enabling their successful, profitable campaigns. I urge those trying to understand how disinformation targets Americans to shift their focus away from content alone and toward the systems moving disinformation into Americans' news feeds. We cannot just debate which meme is more rooted in fact, or we will stay frozen in false debate around content where only those benefiting from disinformation win and the American people lose. We need to debate which systems at play in disinformation should change to end the downward spiral of trust that Americans have started to have in their own democracy and, even more important, in each other. Thank you, and I look forward to your questions.
Mr. Craig, you talked about the need for systemic change to counter disinformation. Why have these companies not done more, and especially with regards to the Spanish language disinformation?
Thank you for the question. While I'm not inside the minds of social media CEOs, I have to imagine that everything they do is about their bottom line. So, for example, they have not signaled that they will invest resources in looking at how their policies affect Spanish speakers. And in fact, they've not done that. They haven't done a good job in English. They don't do a good job for their Spanish speaking voters or users, and they don't do a good job for Americans who speak other languages. We know that those non-English language speakers are at a disproportional risk because the policies that are already poorly enforced are especially not enforced when it comes to their cases. So I wish we had the information about how their business models are tied to their policies being enforced when it comes to Spanish language disinformation, but we don't have that information. And that's why I encourage the committee and I encourage Congress to look at exploring how to get more information and require the platforms to be more transparent about how their systems and their business models are correlated with harms that are targeting American voters.
Thank you so much. We have to make sure we have people over profits. And with that, I yield back, Mr. Chairman.
October 2020 NBC News article, you mentioned that some of the misinformation tactics you're concerned about are coming from micro-influencers and those who utilize platforms like Instagram Live. Can you elaborate on how micro-influencers, both foreign and domestic, utilize misinformation tactics and how that correlates with voter suppression?
Sure. So another smart question was asked in relation to this, which is who is useful in talking to people about what information they're receiving about elections. Micro-influencers usually are built up to blend in with a social media user's environment. They often reference local language that is specific to an individual community. Maybe they're talking about sports teams, and they feel more like a friend. They feel more like a member of your community, someone you can trust. They don't have huge followings. They have somewhat smaller followings, and that small following usually has very high engagement in what they're saying. So sometimes these people are genuine Americans, or they are foreign sources pretending to be Americans. Sometimes they look like news sites. Sometimes they look like interest sites, like they could be talking about music or they could be talking about recipes. And they will slip in information about the election and intentionally have that coming from a source that the audience has grown to trust. When it comes to voter suppression or really any mis or disinformation about election processes or how to vote, when to vote, the best day to vote, the best time to vote, when it comes to any of that information, it's going to be easier to digest and it's not going to be questioned critically by the person looking at it if they trust that user. So as we see more and more people using platforms like Instagram, like TikTok, where influencer culture is very common, it gets more and more challenging to keep track of all the different micro-influencers or alleged micro-influencers that are trying to influence their opinion on the election.
Do you have concerns on how that can be used on platforms that children may utilize or teenagers may utilize, whether it's conversations about the future of democracy, or I was specifically taking how you mentioned specific things kind of inserted in the middle of a cooking discussion or of something that is unrelated. Do you have concerns about a segment of population, teenagers, young adults, and how they're prone to use these platforms?
I do. When I think about young people using social media today, it really makes me feel a little sick to my stomach because of all the online harm that really is moving across these platforms with very little regard to the age of the end user. Not as related to election disinformation, but we've seen countless reporting come out about platform harms targeting younger users. And as we see some platforms like Meta-owned Instagram move to be more like TikTok, move to incorporate more video, we know that we're going to have an even harder time looking at that content because it is extremely difficult to look at video content. And we know that a lot of younger users are the reason that they're making those changes, so they can attract more young people and keep them on their product. I will say there is no one profile of person who is most susceptible to disinformation. It takes advantage of people's mental states. So whether you're a young person and all your friends are on the platform, or whether you're a person who's lonely and you're looking for content to sort of keep you engaged with some type of community, in any case, it can target any type of person, but I do have very specific concerns about the way the platforms have not made age considerations much of a priority to date.
Thank you. Thank you for the answers. Mr. Chairman, I ask unanimous consent to enter into the record a July 18th, 2022 working paper released by the Harvard Kennedy School Shorenstein Center entitled, quote, "President Trump is calling us to fight: what the court documents reveal about the motivations behind January 6th and networked incitement," in which this analysis of over 450 charging and sentencing documents shows that while a variety of factors motivated the rioters, the largest faction of defendants were motivated to come to D.C. by either their desire to support then-President Trump, their concerns about the integrity of the 2020 election, or some combination of both.
Without objection.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Yield back.
And we thank you as well, Mr. Aguilar. I think this may conclude all of the questions from the members. Other members had to step away and will not return. I thank the witnesses for their valuable testimony today, and thank the members certainly for their questions. Members of the subcommittee may have additional questions for these witnesses, and if so, we will ask you to respond to those in writing. The hearing record will be held open for those responses. Again, thank you to everyone for your participation today. Without objection, the Subcommittee on Elections stands adjourned.